I want to thank the gentleman for yielding his time temporarily, and thank the gentleman for bringing up the important subject of the day, which is financial reform in America. I want to thank the gentleman for this opportunity to talk about one of the key elements of financial reform in both the House bill and the now debated Senate bill, which is auditing the Federal Reserve. And I want to congratulate the gentleman, and in fact, everyone in America, because you now own a hotel chain. Congratulations. It's this one right here. You own the Red Roof Inn. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, that's funny. I don't remember buying the Red Roof Inn. But the Federal Reserve Bank, in its wisdom, has done it for you. The Federal Reserve Bank has seen to it that you have the pleasure of ownership of this delightful chain of hotels that extends from sea to shining sea. You, America, you are now the owners of the Red Roof Inn chain. Congratulations. Let me explain to you how that happened. Deep in the mists of ancient history, going all the way back to 2007, a foreign company decided that they wanted to do a leveraged buyout of the Red Roof Inn chain. And so they turned to Wall Street, and Wall Street, in its magical ability, came up with the money, $500 million, to do that. And part of that money, $186 million, came from entities that were formed strictly for the purpose of providing money so that somebody could end up controlling the Red Roof Inn other than the people who originally owned it. These foreigners were able to prevail on Wall Street to come up with the financing to buy the Red Roof Inn. And now at that point, the question was, who was actually going to come up with the money? $186 million. The answer was, Wall Street was going to find some sucker, some fool, that would be willing to take $186 million out of his or her pocket and put it into the pockets of these management company foreign owners. The problem was an earthquake hit Wall Street in 2008 before they could execute on this deal and hand this liability off to John Q. Public. And this financial hurricane that hit Wall Street prevented them from executing on their plan. They had to find some way to come up with somebody, some sucker, who would take over liability for this $186 million loan secured only by this modest hotel chain of limited profitability, being sucked dry already by its foreign owners. And they looked around, and at this point, Bear Stearns was responsible for this. So Bear Stearns looked and looked and looked, tried to find somebody silly enough, unwise enough, to stick this $186 million liability to. And then Bear Stearns itself went kaput, taken over by J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan moved in with the help of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve arranged that J.P. Morgan could take over Bear Stearns' liabilities in general. But there were some liabilities that were so odorous, so awful, that J.P. Morgan just wouldn't take them over, even though the Federal Reserve was stuck with the liability for the great majority of those assets. And those became the maiden lane assets. And among those assets, the absolute dead loser assets, the assets that nobody in their right mind would want, the assets that were so terrible that J.P. Morgan wouldn't take them from Bear Stearns' pocket, from Bear Stearns' dead pocket, even if the Federal Reserve was willing to pay for it. Among those assets was the Red Roof Inn. And who ended up with that? The Federal Reserve. That's right, the Federal Reserve Bank. You know, that organization that dictates the money supply in this country, that has this magical ability to make money out of nothing. They simply make notations on their records, and magically they have more money than they had the day before. The Federal Reserve Bank decided that they would assume responsibility for $100 million before. The Federal Reserve Bank decided that they would assume responsibility for a $186 million loan to a hotel chain. The Federal Reserve became the sucker of last resort, and in doing so, the Federal Reserve made you, America, the sucker of last resort. Let's move on. After 2008, pretty much nothing happened because nobody knew about it. Nobody even knew what was inside the Maiden Lane LLC pot. Nobody knew that it was the Red Roof Inn or anything else. Nobody knew. Why is that? Because we don't audit the Federal Reserve Bank. All they had to do was come up with a line on their balance sheet that said Maiden Lane LLC, and for 2 years nobody knew what the heck was in it. And then after enormous political pressure from Congress, from this entire country, the Federal Reserve gave us a list of assets and what they called notional value for those assets. Because, you know, when you can make money, when you can create it, when you can just make it appear, everything's notional. It's all notional. That's all there is. And so we found out at the beginning of this year that among those things that the taxpayers now have responsibility for through the Federal Reserve is this wonderful, enormously valuable, at least they want you to think this, chain of hotels called the Red Roof Inn. And it stretches all the way from California to Maine. In fact, one of the properties happens to be the Red Roof Inn Convention Center property right in Orlando, right in my district. I am so proud. I think I'll stop by there and ask for a free room. So, what happened then? Well, what do you think? It went bad. It went really sour. Because right now it's not such a good time for the hotel industry, and they leveraged this business to the gills. They had leveraged it up to here, $500 million from a series of properties that barely made any money in great times, and now it's not so great times, as you may have noticed. So what's happened is very simple. They're not paying on the debt. What was debt is now equity. Because when a company goes bankrupt, when it can't pay its creditors, the creditors take over. And interestingly enough, the Wall Street Journal reported just 2 weeks ago that the major creditors of the Red Roof Inn are moving in. They're saying, we're not getting our money from this hotel chain, so the two other entities that put up the money to do this leveraged buyout to this foreign group, they're moving in. They're taking the hotels over. They went to Citibank, and they said, Citibank, what are you doing? They said, well, we're working it out with them. We're moving in. We're taking over the hotels. They went to the third entity, and they said to the third entity, what are you doing? Well, we're trying to work it out with them, but we're taking over the hotels. That's the collateral. Not a single word from the Federal Reserve. Not one single word. Wouldn't it be nice to know what happened to the $186 million that they put up? But we don't know, because we don't audit the Federal Reserve. So we can't know. There's no way to know right now. And the Federal Reserve may be, for all we know, letting these other sharks, these other Wall Street sharks, Citibank and the other entity, move in and take over all these hotels, and maybe they're doing nothing to defend the right of the taxpayers to these assets. We don't know. We just don't know, because we don't audit the Federal Reserve. So America, congratulations, you own a hotel chain. And in fact, if you keep this up, America, you'll own a whole bunch of hotel chains. Because it turned out that the Maiden Lane LLC pot of money that the Federal Reserve assumed liability for, 86% of that is called the hospitality business. So America, before long, take a look, America, you'll have enough to put a hotel on Marvin Gardens, on Park Place, and probably on Boardwalk too. You'll own all the hotels in America, and isn't that something? Isn't that something? You didn't even know it. But look, that's not all the Federal Reserve's put up. The Federal Reserve has put up $500 billion in mortgage-backed securities. What are mortgage-backed securities? They are securities backed by mortgages. Securities backed by homes. So guess what, America? Before long, you will not only be owning hotel chains all around this country, but you'll be owning houses too. Maybe your neighbors' houses, maybe your own houses, but not exactly. Because you see, when the Federal Reserve owns these assets, you don't exactly own it. In fact, since we don't audit the Federal Reserve, you don't own it at all. You have no control over it. Actually, what's happening is that when these mortgages go bad, the Federal Reserve owns your home. And if you can't make the payments, the Federal Reserve becomes your landlord. So isn't that interesting? For all this time we've been hearing about socialism, communism, creeping government control of our economy, how we shouldn't have the government owning GM, how we shouldn't have the government owning major banks, and it's been happening by stealth because we don't audit the Federal Reserve. How else could it possibly be that we could end up owning a hotel chain and not even knowing about it? If you're concerned about socialism in this country, if you're concerned about communism, about government control, let's audit the Federal Reserve. And let's find out once and for all who owns the hotels, who owns the houses, and let's try to put this wild beast that creates money out of nothing and jams it into the pockets of special interests like Maiden Lane, like Bear Stearns, like J.P. Morgan, like all their friends. Let's put them under some degree of restraint before it all comes crashing down, these hotels, these houses, before it all comes crashing down on us. Because every time the Federal Reserve makes that money, every time they do that, every time they create that dollar by their magic, they're taking the dollar that's in your pocket and they're making it cheaper, worth less.
Okay, I'm going to reclaim my time now.
All right, that's fine.
Let me thank the gentleman for...
One last word, if I may say this, if the gentleman will yield. Audit the Federal Reserve.
All right.
Thank you very much.
And let
I
me
yield
just
back.
add that